Joining me now is Dr. John Knott. He's a professor emeritus from the University of Michigan, the English department, and he is also an author. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it, Dr. Knott.
Thanks.
All right, so why don't you go ahead and give me, what are some of your personal experiences with wild places, and how did it influence your writings and your teachings?
Well, the pivotal one was a 2.5-week canoe trip on the Knott River in northern Alaska. With a small group. For the first time I understood what wilderness could be, big wilderness. The vastness, the silence, the absence of other human beings, coming to a gravel beach and finding only animal tracks. And this trip and trips I took with my wife, canoe trips in Ontario, at a time when I was reading the classics of American nature writing, prompted me to offer a course in literature of the American wilderness, and also to start teaching other courses in literature and the environment, and ultimately to be writing about it and editing books that had to do with wildness in some ways. And I found that I really enjoyed the students who were attracted to a course in wilderness literature. A lot of them were outdoor types. They were hunters, they were backpackers, they were canoeists and kayakers, people who'd just grown up going to their family place on a lake. They came with real interest and passion to the course.
All right, so why don't you go ahead and back up for me and give me a little, what is the history, I guess, of wildness? And wildness isn't always perceived in a positive way, right? Has it always been perceived that way?
No, not at all. It's, there's been a revolution in the way we think about it. The first settlers in Michigan in the early 19th century, the first European settlers, thought they were entering the howling wilderness. That's what they called it. And there were dense forests, there were wolves, there were bears in southeast Michigan. One of these settlers, William Nowlin, wrote a memoir sometime later about describing how he helped his father clear the forests near what's present-day Dearborn, and the relief they felt at being able to see the sky. They were able to escape the gloom of the forest, he said, and to let in the light of civilization, which they thought it was. Yet at the same time, he became nostalgic for what they had lost, and he started talking about the grand old forest. And another settler writing about that time, looking back, talked about how the settlers burned most of the trees they cut down just to get rid of them, and said that was the first act of the great tragedy of subduing the forest. So there was a dawning of consciousness there. And at the same time, or a little later, writers were beginning to formulate positive ways of talking about wildness. Thoreau, certainly, who said we all need the tonic of wildness. And he found that lots of places, but in marshes outside Concord, Massachusetts, where he lived. His most famous comment in Wildness is the Preservation of the World reflected his sense that you could find transcendental truths in nature. Other writers at this time were beginning to use religious language to talk about nature, particularly forest, which they like to imagine as sacred spaces. They used metaphors of temples, cathedrals. People still like to talk about cathedral pines. And there is a rich tradition of writing about wildness and wilderness in this country, and it has some Midwestern roots. John Muir grew up on a farm in Wisconsin after emigrating from Scotland. Aldo Leopold spent most of his career in Wisconsin. Sigurd Olson made the boundary waters of northern Minnesota and southern Ontario his territory, and he wrote better about the North Woods than anybody I know, and about what he called the great silences of wilderness. And all these people talked about the appeal of wild places, as many writers have. And for me, the key appeal is that they invite us to slow down, to disengage from normal life, to pay attention to what our senses are telling us, to adapt to the rhythms of nature instead of clock time. And I remember when I used to take canoe trips, long canoe trips, I would leave my watch behind. It was just a gesture, but it helped somehow to get in the right frame of mind. Disconnecting, I thought, was critical. And I found, as many of you probably have, that it's more difficult to get younger people to disconnect these days. Most of them don't even have watches, but they have multiple electronic tethers.
So how do you think wild places are perceived today?
Depends on the person. Some people regard them as places for adventure. Some people go for the solitude, for the silence, and there's a lot of controversy about that.
So what are some of the controversies then?
Well, just to single out some particular ones, take forests, the management of forest lands, state public lands in state parks, state forests, national forest. One basic question is, how wild do we want our wild places to be? And how do we measure wildness? And managers have to cope with a lot of competing demands and interest, and they have to pay attention to environmental laws. And they have to ask themselves questions like, how much old-growth forest should we manage for? How much early successional forest, aspen forest, which is prime habitat for grouse and white-tailed deer? What do we do when there's so many deer they start to change the structure of the forest? To what extent do we respond to the pressures, the public pressures, for more trails for snowmobiles and off-road vehicles? When does the fragmentation of the forest from trails and roads begin to do unacceptable damage to the biological diversity of the place? So another way to pose the question is, how actively do we manage our wild places? And I think the interesting thing is that we've gone all the way from the howling wilderness to designer forests, inevitably, because so much has changed and so much is continuing to change. So managers have to ask themselves when to intervene, how to intervene. Even in wilderness areas, which are the most passively managed of all, there may be times when they feel they're being overrun by invasive species or something has happened where they have to step in. But there are no easy answers.
There are a lot of difficult questions. I was just going to say, Dr. John Knott, thank you so much for joining us and giving us that perspective. So what is your favorite wild place in the Great Lakes? We went to social media, Twitter and Facebook, to ask people what they thought, and here were some of their top answers.